This video is the third part of the series on Sihang Warehouse. If you haven't watched part 1 or part 2, I highly recommend that you watch those videos first. I have included the links in the description. Chinese troops in the warehouse worked on building and improving their fortifications throughout the night. As the Sihang Warehouse was technically two adjacent structures, soldiers managed to connect the two buildings by creating holes in the wall that separated them. Another hole was created on the easternmost wall of the warehouse that separated it from a row of shops, which allowed for the passage of both people and supplies between the warehouse and the British concession through these shops. This path would play a very important role for the rest of the battle. The footage that you see here was taken from just within the British concession at the intersection of Tibet Road and North Suzhou Creek Road. You can clearly see the hole in the store which leads into the warehouse. British soldiers stand right beside it, and behind them, Lazi Bridge as well as the natural gas storage tanks are visible. Dawn on the 28th brought with it Japanese aircraft. Around 7 a.m., flights of Japanese planes began circling the warehouse. None of these aircraft attacked the warehouse out of fear of hitting the international settlement. The Chinese machine gun emplacements on the roof prevented the planes from getting close enough to drop their payloads accurately. No Japanese infantry attack came on the morning of the 28th. However, around 10 a.m., as Lieutenant Colonel Xie Jingyuan was surveying the area from the roof of the warehouse, he noticed a few Japanese soldiers along North Suzhou Creek Road. Taking a rifle from one of the sentries, he managed to hit one of the soldiers on the road using only the iron sights on his rifle. Major Yang Ruifu, who was with him, remembered this incident enough to have included it in his memoirs, noting that the lieutenant colonel was a very good shot. The Shanghai Chamber of Commerce received a request to deliver a flag of the Republic of China to the defenders at the warehouse. This request was possibly made by Zhang Boting, the chief of staff of the 88th Division, who had stayed in the international settlement to aid the 1st Battalion defending Sihang Warehouse. The 23-year-old Girl Scout Yang Huimin helped the defenders acquire a small flag which was raised at the warehouse around 3 p.m. However, it was felt that the size of the flag was too small. She then returned to the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce to request a larger one. Also around 3 in the afternoon, the defenders observed Japanese troops northeast of the warehouse, moving into position 4 to 5 artillery pieces. The artillery pieces were described by Major Yang as flat trajectory cannons, which suggests that they were a type of Japanese mountain gun, which were very common in Shanghai. These guns had to be moved close to the warehouse as the Japanese couldn't risk having stray shells land in the international settlement. The Chinese opened up with machine gun fire in an attempt to pin down the Japanese soldiers. In response, Japanese machine gunners fired back. The Japanese had set up machine guns on the rooftops of buildings west of the warehouse. These buildings included the previously mentioned 4 stories tall Bank of Communications warehouse building. Between this building and Sihang Warehouse, there was the Shanghai Fuyuan and Fukang Bank warehouse, as well as the number 1 warehouse of the Bank of Jiangsu. Both of these buildings were 3 stories tall, and on this map has been represented as one building. Although these buildings were not as tall as the 6 stories Sihang Warehouse, they were the closest in height in the surrounding area that was accessible to the Japanese. From these positions, they fired back at the Chinese troops within the warehouse. This exchange of fire continued for around 2 hours before things started to quiet down around 5 p.m. However, after the fighting had stopped, the defenders realized that the warehouse no longer had running water. It is possible that the Japanese had cut off water access to the buildings sometime during the fighting. As a result, soldiers had to conserve the water that they had, with the order being passed along that no one was to wash themselves from that point on. Furthermore, the soldiers also started storing sewage and liquid waste in case a fire broke out in the warehouse. At 8 p.m. that evening, Lieutenant Colonel Xie Jinyuan and Major Yang Ruifu addressed all the soldiers in the warehouse. As the lieutenant colonel had only recently been promoted to the position of deputy regiment commander of the 524th, most of the men in the 1st Battalion did not know him very well. As such, Major Yang started by introducing the lieutenant colonel to the 1st Battalion. They then confirmed the order to defend Sihang Warehouse and stated that no one should expect to survive the battle. Every man was allowed to write a simple will, which was to be collected and, if possible, sent to their families at a later date. The men were then ordered to work throughout the night and complete the fortifications on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floors of the warehouse. Around 9 p.m., a telephone was either found in or delivered to the warehouse, with sources differing between how the defenders acquired it. The phone connection allowed for easy communication between the international settlement and the warehouse. Using this connection, the officers in the warehouse were able to send a request, likely through the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce, to the U.S. Marines stationed in the international settlement to help evacuate the wounded. Like the British, the U.S. also had troops stationed in the international settlement to protect American citizens and interests within Shanghai. The troops stationed in Shanghai were from the 4th Marines and was known as the China Marines. However, at this time, the 6th Marines would have also been in Shanghai to reinforce the 4th Regiment, as the Battle of Shanghai raged on around them. The U.S. Navy also had a presence in Shanghai as well as other cities along the Yangtze River. In fact, the first U.S. Navy ship to be sunk by the Japanese was attacked less than 2 months after the events in this video, around the city of Nanjing, 300 kilometers away. However, that is for a different video if there is interest. The U.S. forces agreed for the wounded to be transported into the international settlement for treatment, and later that night, the wounded soldiers were taken out of the warehouse. The wounded soldiers were ordered not to reveal the actual number of defenders in the warehouse, which totaled around 420. It was feared that if the Japanese found out the true strength of the defending forces, they would be able to mount a large attack and overrun the defenders. Instead, the soldiers were to say that there were 800 soldiers in the warehouse in order to confuse the Japanese and hopefully allow the defenders to hold out for a bit longer. The same information had previously been provided by other soldiers to those on the outside. As a result, reporters and journalists started using the term the 800 heroes to describe the defenders, and the name stuck. This has led many to assume that there were 800 soldiers in the warehouse, and even today, this is one of the biggest misconceptions about the battle. While the wounded were leaving the warehouse, another group of soldiers were making their way towards it. Among them was the commander of 1st Company, Captain Shangguan Zhibiao. These men had been unable to join the 1st Battalion on the first day of battle, but managed to make it to the warehouse on the evening of the 2nd. From this point on, command of 1st Company was transferred back to Captain Shangguan. Around midnight, Yang Huimin, along with a few other scout members, returned to the warehouse. This time, they had with them many donated supplies as well as a larger flag. Early reports suggested that Yang Huimin had done this alone. Part of the reason for this was the realization that the lives of these Girl Scouts could be in danger if their names were publicized and the Japanese learned of their involvement in the battle. These fears were not unfounded. Unknown to many nowadays, the Battle of Shanghai in 1937 was not the first time Shanghai had been attacked by Japan in the 1930s. In 1932, the two sides had engaged in ferocious fighting within the city in what would be known as the January 28th incident. It was during this incident that 4 Chinese Boy Scouts were killed by Japanese soldiers while tending to the wounded. As such, there was likely the fear of Japanese retaliation. Yang Huimin was likely chosen to take all the credit for delivering the flag and the supplies due to the fact that she was not local to Shanghai, like many of her fellow scouts. Being from the city of Zhenjiang over 200 kilometers away, she would be in considerably less danger, as she won't be very well known and that she could lead the city a lot easier. The supplies that the Girl Scouts delivered to the warehouse had been donated by those who had heard about the heroic Chinese troops still in the city. These donations included food such as bread and fruits, as well as cigarettes for the soldiers to smoke. Along with the supplies, Newspapers that highlighted their achievements were also sent to the soldiers. Letters of praise were sent to them as well by patriotic Chinese civilians. Major Yang ordered a squad from the machine gun company to divide up the supplies evenly and hand them out to the different companies. These supplies proved to be a huge morale boost for the troops in the warehouse, many of whom haven't eaten a good meal in days. It was also decided that the larger flag was to be raised above the warehouse at dawn the next day. By now, it was already into the early hours of the 29th, and the second day of battle at the warehouse had already come to an end.